We could do nothing. Our guns would not reach the plane's altitude, and not a single Japanese fighter plane was airborne. I could only cross my fingers as the bombs came curving down. Fortunately, the American bombers, apparently new arrivals at Java, did not carry heavy bomb loads, and their aim was not good. One 250-pound bomb did score a direct hit on the No. 2 turret of cruiser Myoko in the centre of the harbour. More than 20 were killed and 40 others wounded. Splinters of that bomb reached seaplane tender Chitose, moored 500 metres away, and damaged 5 planes on her deck. Not one Japanese plane was able to take off in time to pursue the raiders. My Amatsukaze was so near the beach we could not move an inch to evade the bombs. Luck alone saved us. I had never felt so miserable as on that day when I watched the 12th 374-ton Myoko, our teammate since X-Day, limping out of Davao Bay on its way back to Japan for repairs. We could not afford this kind of stupidity. In January 1942, I took part in the invasion of the Netherlands East Indies, supporting the landing operations at Manado and Kendari. In both landings there was little opposition from the local garrisons, but the poor quality of our air support was an ill omen for the future. The Japanese Navy did not have enough planes to cover our landings, and the few planes we saw were manned by second-rate flyers. Without proper training, they reported ghost ships that did not exist, bombed whales that they mistook for submarines, and even shot down our own transport planes in the confusion of air battles. My own experience in hunting submarines had been no more satisfying. On the night of January 31st, while escorting transports to a landing at Bill Bay on Ambon Island, I caught a submarine on the surface with my searchlight. We failed to hit with 3 salvos, and it got away. Regretfully, I signalled our failure to the other ships, warning that the enemy had probably escaped unscathed and might come back. I sweated out the next 2 hours. The enemy sub might choose our slow troop-laden transports as easy targets. Our sonar watch was reinforced, but they picked up no further trace of the submarine. My uneasiness continued, however, until Aero 100 when our convoy reached the landing point. The landing started at 0120 on February 1st, with no pre-invasion bombardment from our warships. That was not in accordance with the original schedule. After my encounter with the sub, the enemy must have been fully alerted, and I was itching for a chance to bombard. I thought it meaningless to attempt an invasion against alerted enemy forces, with no pre-landing bombardment. Nevertheless, no bombardment orders came from the flagship. Admiral Tanaka explained to me after the war that he had omitted bombardment, figuring that the ground opposition, even though alerted, would be weak. An even more binding reason, Tanaka explained, was that he had orders to conserve ammunition as much as practicable. That may sound ridiculous to Americans, but it was a grim reality to Japan. In the prosecution of that stupendous war, we were constantly reminded of the need for conserving. At the same time, we were experiencing American saturation bombings and massive pre-landing bombardments that were incomprehensible to us. Navy gunners were trained constantly to hit the target with opening salvos. Range-finding salvos, as used by Americans, were completely out of the question for us. That was an additional reason for my displeasure at the poor marksmanship of my gunners in shooting at the enemy submarine. The landing troops, as I had anticipated, were stopped at the beach by enemy ground fire. Commander Konosuke Ieki, in charge of the invasion troops, signalled at 0200, "We are pinned down and the landing is thwarted." But he would not ask for support bombardment. On the bridge of Amatsukaze, I squirmed with vexation. The situation was disgusting in every respect. At 0320, the landing troops finally signalled that the beachhead was secured. But there was more trouble ahead. At 500, they radioed, "Enemy fortress guns cover our flanks." Word came at noon by radio that Commander Ieki had been killed in action. It was ridiculous. Why did he have to die like that? A preliminary bombardment and continued shipboard fire support would have spared his life and many others. Stupid. Stupid. That sad news was followed shortly by orders from Vice Admiral Reizo Tanaka. All escort vessels close beach to pick up casualties. Amatsukaze loaded 30 dead and 90 wounded. Meanwhile, the ground fighting was stalemated. We could not shoot now because of the confined ground situation. Japanese float planes from tender Chitos finally appeared early the following day and attacked the enemy's fortified positions. Still, there were no fighters or bombers from carriers Hiryu or Soryu. I simply could not understand why aerial cooperation was so inadequate. The seaplanes, coming in 6 at a time, were manned by brilliant flyers. They attacked enemy gun positions with telling effect. At one time they tangled with 5 enemy bombers, apparently from the Dutch East Indies, and shot down 2 of them. No Japanese planes were lost. The Dutch-Australian garrison surrendered on the first evening of the invasion, February 1st, 1942. 200 garrison troops were taken prisoner. They told us that some 70 mines were laid at the main harbour on the southern side of Ambon Island. Our minesweepers spent a week on the hair-raising job of sweeping the narrow harbour. 3 of them were hit by mines and sank with their crews. 2 days after the surrender, a transport moored near the mouth of the mine-filled harbour signalled, "Ship under torpedo attack from seaward." And indeed it was. Fortunately, none of the torpedoes found targets, but the alert sent me into action immediately. I figured that these torpedoes must have come from the very same submarine that had fooled me 3 days earlier. I was grimly determined to find and sink it. For 5 hours, sleek Amatsukaze chugged about at a snail-like 11 knots. Our insensitive sonar gear would not function effectively if the ship moved any faster. An aggressive submarine could make an easy mark of such a slow target, even though it was a destroyer armed with deadly anti-submarine weapons. I thought of destroyer Sagiri, sunk by a submarine torpedo near Borneo in December. When a destroyer is patrolling, concentrating on spotting an enemy, it is fully on guard. If any sub was attracted by Amatsukaze, snailing at this tempting speed, I felt ready for it. But we picked up no trace of the submarine. As the slow hours stretched into 5, the situation developed into a war of nerves. At 21:34, a sonoman shouted exultantly, "Submarine, distant 400 metres, bearing 10 degrees to port." I ordered, "Everybody to combat station. Prepare depth charges, 8 charges, set for depth of 50 metres." The sonar officer chanted in a calm, professional voice, "Sub at 1800 metres, 40 degrees to port. The sub now at 1300 metres, 50 degrees to the left. It seems to be swerving to the left." Amatsukaze's course was adjusted to the new bearings. At 21:53, the sonar officer shrieked in dismay, "Lost track of sub." Strangely calm at this news, I immediately judged that the sub had slipped into a blind angle. It and Amatsukaze must be cruising on an identical course. Japanese sonar in those early days operated on the principle of sending out sound waves and calculating an object's distance by checking the rebounding waves. These devices were not sensitive enough to pick up a sub's engine noises directly. My head was filled with calculations of bearings, angles, and distance. The answer came almost reflexively. The sub is 180 degrees, or dead ahead, moving at 9 knots, now 1,000 metres away, at a depth of about 30 metres. I ordered speed boosted to 21 knots and looked at the second hand of my watch. I rapidly diagrammed the 2 ships' navigation curves. At 21:58 we released 8 depth charges when I believed the enemy sub was directly below. I put Amatsukaze about and turned back, poised for another series of a depth charge attack. The surface of the sea gave off a strong odour of diesel oil in the dark night. We could see nothing. The smell of oil grew stronger. We were well aware of skunk tactics used by submarines under attack. By releasing oil while submerged, they try to induce pursuers to believe they have been sunk. We searched the site diligently for 2 hours, but picked up no trace of our quarry. I wrote the sub off as sunk, but there was no exultation in me. 4 days passed, and there were no other reports of the sub. It was obvious that I had scored a kill. I realized grimly that there is little real cause for elation in warfare. I learned a great deal from the Ambon operation. On the 9th of February, I returned to Davao in escort of the transport Kirishima Maru and carrying some of the wounded and dead who had fallen at Ambon. The voyage was uneventful. Peace and quiet was restored completely in Davao. Hostilities in the Philippines were now limited to Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island. Other scenes of war had moved far to the south. Davao had not seen an enemy plane in more than a month. Huge bundles of letters from home awaited us. There were also many packages and comfort kits sent by relatives and other friendly civilians in the homeland. On arriving at Davao, I enjoyed a long, leisurely bath for the first time in 20 days. When a Japanese destroyer was on combat assignment, even its skipper willingly skipped the luxury of a bath. I relaxed in my small cabin after ordering my crew to bathe and take it easy. The ship's store was ordered opened. It carried liquors, candy, and toilet goods. Men were allowed to buy and drink liquor on board with the sanction of their skipper. Small as my cabin was, it was still the best quarters in the narrow ship. The 6 by 9 foot space was filled with a bed, toilet equipment, a small round table, a wardrobe, and a sofa and stool. On the table was a photograph of my family. Murata, a young sailor, delivered my mail, which included packages and letters. "Did you receive your mail, Murata?" "Yes, sir, I did." He beamed, saluted, and turned around. I opened a letter from my wife, dated January 4th. She reported that the 3 children and herself were well and happy. A postscript, however, reported disturbing news. The day before yesterday, I took the children to Tokyo for a visit with relatives. Our maid was away, and when I returned to Kamakura, the door lock was broken and all our valuables were gone. That was distressing. My wife was from a good family and was totally unused to this kind of thing. In my anxiety about this, I downed several cups of sake, rice wine. There was a package from my eldest brother, who lived in Osaka. It contained a waistband with 1,000 stitches, handmade with crimson thread, a traditional Japanese charm against enemy bullets. My brother's wife wrote that she had stood at a downtown street corner to solicit 999 other women to contribute a stitch each to it. Gratefully, I put it about my waist, although I held no belief in the superstition. A letter from my brother contained further distressing news. His eldest son, Shigeyoshi Hashimoto, 25, a machine gun officer in the 4th Army Division, had died in December of tuberculosis. This nephew had been my favourite. I closed my eyes and mumbled a prayer for him. Feeling depressed, I stopped opening the mail, had a few more drinks, and walked out onto the bridge. It was a lovely day. The harbour looked beautiful under the bright tropical sun. The duty officer sat gazing wistfully at the shore as I approached. He stood up and saluted. "Announce that I am authorizing shore leave tomorrow for all hands. They will be organized into 3 groups and each will have 3 hours of liberty." The lieutenant's eyes lit up with excitement and he immediately started to spread the good word. Not one man in my crew of 300 had been ashore during the past 50 days, so the announcement was received with great joy. I returned to the cabin and opened another letter. It was from Kure, but the sender's name on the back of the envelope was unknown to me. The letter read, "I am Hinagiku, one of the geisha girls, who served in the party before your departure to the war." I groaned. I, the father of 3 children, certainly had not anticipated a love letter from a geisha girl. The letter was filled with prosaic good wishes, which ended on a decidedly sour note. "The landlady of the restaurant has reminded me that you forgot to settle the account before your sudden departure. We should be happy if you will pay the attached bill at your convenience." This certainly put me to shame. I was disgusted to realize that at my age I could be so shiftless. I had a sudden desire to get drunk and downed another bottle of sake. The last package was from Hiroshima, and I knew by the childish handwriting of its sender that it was a comfort kit. Japanese school children made these little gift packages on their own and sent them with a note to some unknown serviceman at the front. My package yielded a set of picture postcards showing the famed Hiroshima landscape, a sketch by the sender, a bunch of envelopes, and a letter pad. An accompanying note read, "I am a 9-year-old schoolgirl in Hiroshima. All of us school children here are studying hard. We sincerely pray you will fight hard for the sake of our nation." This was the only really heartening letter of the day. I stopped drinking and began writing replies, first to the unknown Hiroshima girl. "My dear young lady, thank you very much for your very kind comfort kit. I am the commanding officer of a destroyer. I am grateful and happy to receive your sincere good wishes." The following day I went ashore with the first of my crew headed for their 3-hour liberty. It was good to see that the streets of Davao had not been damaged. They were crowded with crews from other warships anchored in the harbour. Housewives of Japanese residents in the city had set up refreshment stands with signs reading, "Please help yourself to coffee and tea, served free by your fellow countrymen." Filipinos were also walking the streets peacefully. The girls with their elaborate hairdos and bright ribbons and the men with brilliantly pomaded hair presented a gay picture. It was surprising for me to note, however, that most of them were barefoot. In Japan, no one walks barefoot on a city street. Anyone who can afford it owns a pair of shoes. Those who cannot wear wooden clogs. I was intrigued by the native scene. Theatres were showing the latest American movies to packed audiences. On side streets, I noticed a number of houses marked Japanese Military Recreation Center. Many sailors and soldiers were queuing up in front of them. These were brothels whose Japanese, Korean, and Okinawan occupants followed wherever the Japanese military moved. I noted a sudden uneasiness among the men, obviously because of my presence. I said to my lieutenant, "Let's part here. I must go to headquarters. I'll meet you at noon. Caution your chiefs to count noses at the pier." "Aye, aye, sir," grinned the lieutenant. As we parted, the men shouted gaily, "Bravo! Long live our skipper!" On February 27, 28, 1942, I took part in the Battle of Java Sea. That action is worthy of note as one of the few major sea battles of World War II in which no planes were involved except for reconnaissance. Accordingly, it deserves a full description and analysis. There have been many books by both Allied and Japanese authors which purport to tell the story of this action. Most of the Allied books were written too soon after the war. The authors' feelings seem still to have been running too high to permit objectivity and historical detachment. Nor do the Japanese books thus far impress me as being either objective or accurate. Part of this shortcoming is attributable to a lack of source documents, to be sure, but defeated and dispirited commanders are really not capable of giving objective accounts of their battles. Most of the commanding officers of the Allied ships in this battle were killed during the action. Therefore, it is not possible to reconstruct all the details of the Allied side. Rear Admiral Takeo Takagi, the top Japanese commander in the battle, was killed at Saipan in 1944. He was survived by his Chief of Staff, Captain Ko Nagasawa, now a top-ranking admiral of the new Japanese Navy, and Nagasawa's assistant, Lieutenant Commander Kotaro Ishikawa, who was Takagi's intelligence officer. Before writing this chapter, I had long discussions with each of them, as well as other surviving officers involved in the battle. The Allied fleet made first contact with the Japanese convoy off Surabaya and reached out in an effort to destroy it. At the outset, the Allied column of 3 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers managed to box the 41 slow transports of the convoy, as well as its escort of 10 destroyers and 2 light cruisers. The transports were loaded with a division of army troops. There were also 2 Japanese heavy cruisers assigned to this operation, but they lagged some 150 miles behind the convoy. With all their initial advantages of position and numerical superiority, the Allies failed to sink a single Japanese vessel in this encounter. Though the many errors committed by both sides seemed to offset each other, the really decisive factor, in my opinion, was morale. It is interesting to compare this battle with what took place at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. There, the Japanese fleet, led by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, played an almost identical role to that of Dutch Rear Admiral KWFM Doorman's forces in the Java Sea battle. At Leyte Gulf, Kurita cornered 4 of the enemy's light carriers, slow and vulnerable, and could have dealt them a shattering blow. But he turned around at the critical moment and gave up a brilliant chance. That was exactly what the Allied fleet did in the Java Sea. Kurita went to Leyte with grim determination, but with full realization that he had no chance of winning against the overwhelming forces of the enemy. It is important to note that psychological background before criticizing his seemingly foolish reversal. In February 1942, a sense of hopelessness reigned among Allied officers at Surabaya. They saw little or no chance of survival. The Allied fleet of 15 fighting ships was licking its wounds. All these ships knew that they were likely to face a real showdown within a week. Allied commanders recalled the Pearl Harbor attack and the sinking of Prince of Wales and Repulse 2 months earlier. They had almost refused to accept the news at first, and there was still disbelief in their minds. But facts piled on facts. Singapore had just fallen. Complete occupation of the Philippines appeared imminent. The Japanese were surging to the south, reducing one outpost after another. The Imperial Navy's mighty task force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, was known to be moving in the waters of the South Pacific. It appeared to enemy eyes as a mammoth super armada. They simply had no way of knowing just how huge it was, or how many carriers Japan had. This confusion sprang in part from the fact that the enemy could not tell whether attacking Japanese planes came from carriers or land bases. The massive air raids on the Philippines, carried out a few hours after Pearl Harbor, were believed to have come from Japanese carriers. Actually, the planes came from Formosa. A series of bomber attacks over Java were also carried out by land-based Japanese planes from Jolo, Balikpapan, and Kendari. To Allied officers at Surabaya, these planes appeared to have come from Japanese carriers in the Java Sea. On February 1st, a small American task force attacked the Marshall Islands. Nagumo's task force promptly rushed out from Truk on a 1,500-mile sortie to the Marshalls. Allies at Surabaya, hearing of this movement, thought it was now safe to go out and attack the Japanese. Their 4 cruisers and 7 destroyers steamed to Balikpapan, hoping to repeat the achievements of Commander Paul Talbot. The Japanese were not napping this time. 60 Japanese bombers and fighters, which had come from Formosa to Kendari, swooped down on February 4th and damaged the Allied fleet. These ships limped back to Surabaya, stunned by what they believed to have been carrier-borne Japanese planes. The whole affair was a nightmare to them. On the 19th, another event, impossible in the eyes of the Surabaya headquarters, occurred right over their heads. Allied intelligence reports said the Nagumo task force had turned before reaching the Marshalls and was headed toward Australia. Early that morning, Nagumo hurled 188 bombers and fighters in a devastating raid on Port Darwin. About noon the same day, 23 Zero fighters swarmed over Surabaya and shot down 40 Allied fighters, mostly P-36, in a brief air melee. Even if the intelligence man at Balikpapan had reported accurately that these Japanese Navy fighters had flown 450 miles from Formosan bases, the Allied officers would probably not have believed it. They were all convinced that the Zeros were from carriers. Later that same day, a group of Japanese bombers from Kendari struck a secret enemy airfield at Jombang, near Surabaya, and destroyed P-40s, Buffaloes, and British Hurricanes based there. Japanese combat planes were fast gaining respect in the eyes of the enemy. It was no chance thing that Britain's proudest battleship had fallen victim to their attack. The same fate could meet any of the remaining ships at Surabaya. Against this background, the commanding officers at Surabaya on February 20th mulled over the latest reports that two massive Japanese convoys were heading toward Java. One convoy of 41 transports with some 20 escorting warships left Jolo for Surabaya on February 19th. The other, with 56 transports and 15 escorts, had left Cam Bay, Indochina, 2 days earlier, heading for Western Java. The High Command at Surabaya must have been in agony. If the Allied fleet went out to tackle one of the Japanese convoys, it might win a battle, but it would not then have a chance of defeating the second convoy. The most difficult factor for the enemy, however, must have been the unpredictability of Nagumo's mighty task force. It might turn up at any moment to swing its sledgehammer blows at the Allied fleet, now devoid of air cover. Meanwhile, Japanese planes were able to come and go at will. At the Japanese High Command, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Combined Fleet, had met with his staff officers on February 17th aboard the battleship Nagato, moored at Hashirajima near Kure in central Japan. He had already ordered Nagumo to turn around and hit Port Darwin without pursuing the small American task force. We must secure oil and other resources of the Dutch East Indies. That is of higher priority than pursuing any small American force. Yamamoto doubtless had in mind the outline of his forthcoming Midway operation. When his staff had studied all intelligence data and reported to him, Yamamoto concluded that the Allied surface fleet in Surabaya was no potential threat to Japanese actions, and he ordered the two convoys, each carrying an army division, to weigh anchor. The landing operation does not require the support of a major task force, Yamamoto ruled. So Nagumo pushed 220 miles north of Port Darwin on February 19th. On February 25th, Yamamoto held another staff meeting. It was decided that the Allied fleet was completely demoralized and no longer in shape to attempt any major action. Yamamoto cancelled his earlier plan of using land-based planes as air cover for the Japanese convoys. Nagumo was ordered to the Indian Ocean to sink Allied warships expected to be fleeing from Surabaya. This audacity resulted in jeopardizing the operation of at least the convoy which I escorted. The 41 transports were in two columns, 600 metres between ships and 2,000 metres between columns. They zigzagged sluggishly at 10 knots. The formation was spearheaded by 4 minesweepers on a line of bearing with 3,000-metre intervals, followed at 3,000 metres by 3 destroyers, similarly spread. Then came cruiser Naka, the flagship, flanked by 2 small patrol ships. 1 destroyer to port and 1 to starboard guarded the middle section of the long transport columns. Another escort group, consisting of Destroyer Division 2, which included Maya Matsukaze and 3 other destroyers, led by Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's flagship Jintsu, was in position farther out on the port side. This group had taken part briefly in the Timor Island landing operation after Ambon, and we had joined the convoy at Makassar on February 25th. 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Haguro, followed haughtily behind the convoy at a distance of some 200 miles. The 20-mile-long convoy was quite a spectacle. An obvious laxity prevailed in the transports with their ill-trained crews. Many transports emitted huge clouds of black smoke from their funnels. Many used their radios in violation of no transmission orders, or failed to observe blackout rules at night. Enemy submarines could have had a field day against such easy targets. Most disturbing, however, was the dreadfully slow pace of the trailing heavy cruisers, the only ships of the force which packed a real punch in case the enemy fleet chose to attack us. The weather was beautiful, sparkling sun by day, and bright moonlight silvered the sea every night. Even at night, trained eyes could span the length of the entire force. 5 Allied submarines had been observed by our reconnaissance planes, but none menaced our ships. To this day, I do not understand why enemy submarines failed to come out. On the morning of the 26th, the sea south of Borneo was calm. I awakened from a brief nap and pored over the latest information. Our reconnaissance planes and intelligence agents reported a formidable minefield all along the Surabaya coast, adding to the hazard of many sunken ships. The reports also said, "The Allies are still flying bombers, including some B-17s recently arrived from Africa, and fighters at Malang and other small strips." The situation certainly did not warrant all our optimism. At 0800, a PBY Catalina float plane suddenly slipped out of the clouds to the southeast and headed toward my ship. "Enemy plane dead ahead! Open fire!" I yelled. An anti-aircraft machine gun fired one burst as the PBY dropped a bomb, a bit too early, which raised a large water pillar about 500 meters ahead. The plane swerved, gained speed, and disappeared into the overcast. The whole action was so brief that we didn't even have time to get excited. This was most unusual. The more I thought about this awkward attack, the more puzzled I was. If the plane was on reconnaissance, as it must have been, it was foolish to have made its presence so obvious. It was still more ridiculous for the plane to drop just one bomb at a destroyer. A transport would have been a much more profitable target. In a way, it was good to know that the enemy was aware of our operation. A lookout called attention to a big white ship to port heading in our direction. Using large binoculars, I saw what appeared to be a hospital ship of about 4,000 tons. Its presence in this area was the second puzzle of the day. We hoisted flags, ordering it to stand by for inspection, and sped toward the ship. Through binoculars, I watched a small elderly man, apparently the ship's skipper, on deck hastily putting on a uniform. His hands were shaking and he appeared very nervous. As we closed, I read the name Opton Note, and our ship register confirmed that it was a Dutch hospital ship. Lieutenant Goro Iwabuchi and 6 armed petty officers rowed over in a boat and boarded the ship. An hour later they returned to report some 15 doctors and nurses on board in addition to the crew. I asked for instructions, and Admiral Tanaka replied, "Even a hospital ship is objectionable in this area. Take it to the rear to anchor among our supply ships." I spent all morning chaperoning the hospital ship. After handing it over to the care of the supply squadron commander, I rushed back at 26 knots and rejoined the escort at 14:15. A few fighter planes from Balikpapan flew cover over the convoy. They came after the PBY had attacked us and stayed overhead until about 1900. By that time, a cool breeze had sprung up. I lit a cigarette and asked the navigator the time of sunset. Lieutenant J.G. Toshio Koyama answered that the sun would set at 1948. My smoke was interrupted by the staccato sound of anti-aircraft guns. Seeing that cruiser Jinsu was firing, I ordered, "Battle stations, air attack." Looking up, I saw 2 B-17 bombers coming out of the cloud deck some 4,000 meters high and yelled, "Open fire!" The 12.7-centimeter guns swung up to 75 degrees, but still could not bring the planes into range. The smaller guns were completely ineffective, but they fired as if their noise might scare the bombers. The B-17s, apparently from Java, dropped 6 500 lbs, bombs. 4 of them fell about 1,500 meters to starboard of a Matsukaze. 2 hit the water some 500 meters on destroyer Hatsukaze's port hand. Poor marksmanship. The bombers attacked our fighting ships instead of troop-laden transports. That meant that the enemy wanted to knock out our fighting ships so his fleet could tackle the whole convoy. This was alarming, and I felt braced for the challenge. The morning hours of the following day, February 27th, were uneventful. Our crew continued with routine training. Then, at 11:50, just when everyone was ready for lunch, 4 big bombs exploded without warning. Huge columns of water rose about 200 meters ahead of destroyer Yukikaze, cruising 3,000 meters to the right of my ship. The preceding day we had seen the bombers before they attacked. Today we were caught unawares, and belatedly I again discovered 2 B-17s flying just below the 4,000-meter cloud cover. The flying fortresses had certainly achieved surprise. It was only inept bombing that spoiled their chance. Their aiming again at the highly maneuverable warships puzzled me. Why didn't they hit at the sluggish transports? One hit by a 500 lb. Bomb could easily have sunk a transport and disrupted the whole Japanese schedule. Today, years after the battle, I still believe that was a big mistake. Japan also made a serious error in launching this operation without sufficient air cover for the surface forces, but that mistake was offset by the ineffective and unwise tactics of the Allied planes. 10 minutes after the B-17 encounter, the convoy altered course 90 degrees for Surabaya. Until then, we had been heading westward, in a feint movement. We were already 60 miles north of Surabaya. Soon afterward, a Japanese scout plane from Balikpapan flashed a report. 5 enemy cruisers and 6 destroyers, 63 miles 310 degrees from Surabaya at 1200 hours. This force is heading on an 80-degree course at 12 knots. Nachi, 12,374 tons, one of the 2 heavy cruisers following us far to the rear, immediately catapulted its scout plane to maintain contact with the enemy fleet. The fleet was surprisingly near and apparently headed toward us. Was it coming to fight us? We waited uneasily for further scout plane reports. 2 long hours passed. At 14:05, the Nachi plane radioed that the enemy force of 5 cruisers and 10 destroyers was continuing on the same course. With 2 of our cruisers 150 miles to the rear, the enemy fleet was definitely more powerful than our escort. Admiral Takagi ordered the transports to turn northward. I no longer felt the tropical heat. Cold sweat ran down my back. We had blundered into a trap. If the enemy picked up speed immediately, he could easily tear our convoy to shreds and sink the transports like clay pigeons. I shuddered at the prospect. The 2 forces drew steadily closer, and I wondered why the enemy fleet still cruised at a mere 12 knots. At 15:10, Nachi's scout plane radioed an amazing message. The enemy fleet has turned around and is headed toward Surabaya. Admiral Takagi, on Nachi's bridge, laughed. The enemy ships were merely staying clear of our air raids on Surabaya. The enemy is in no shape to fight us. We will stick to our original plans and schedule. The force will turn and head south again. At 16:30, there was another surprise message from the Nachi scout plane. The enemy fleet has turned around again. The double column formation is now shifting to single column. The enemy is gaining speed and is headed on a course of 20 degrees. 10 minutes later, another message came. The enemy speed is 22 knots. It is heading directly for our convoy. There was no longer any doubt about the enemy's intention. I checked the chart and found that the distance to the enemy fleet was 60 miles. If both sides ran at 20 knots, we would meet within an hour and a half. Takagi, suddenly glum and angry, ordered the transports to turn around once again. He also ordered the cruisers to catapult their observation planes and the escort ships to line up into fighting formation. Cruisers Nachi and Haguro belatedly began to pick up speed. My flotilla quickly formed in a column, cruiser Jintsu followed by the 4 destroyers. The transports turned around and fanned out. Their movement was painfully slow. They were mostly requisitioned merchant ships, and their crews were untrained. It was distressing to watch their disarray. Many were baffled at the repeatedly changing orders, and they were unable to respond quickly. Most irritating of all was the slow arrival of Nachi and Haguro. They were so many miles to the rear. Each of these 2 heavy cruisers packed a punch equal to that of 10 destroyers. Without them, I did not see how we could fight the powerful enemy fleet. If the enemy increased speed to 30 knots, they might arrive at any moment. If that happened, what could we do? At 1700, the chaos subsided as the transports resumed an orderly formation escorted by patrol ships and minesweepers. Behind our flotilla, 4 other destroyers formed up. The other flotilla, consisting of cruiser Naka and 7 destroyers, brought up the rear. The Japanese warships now sped at 24 knots, ready to fight. I scanned the horizon as we cruised around the 2-mile-long column, but found no trace of our 2 heavy cruisers. I mumbled profanely in my vexation. "Enemy ship! shouted Warrant Officer Shigeru Iwata, who, gifted with amazing eyesight, was the chief spotter on the bridge. I looked where he was pointing. I saw several masts to the south. They soon became visible to everyone on board. From pictures I had studied, the masts were clearly recognizable as belonging to the Dutch cruiser De Ruyter. De Ruyter is distant 28,000 meters, about 20 miles, Iwata chanted. It is closing rapidly. I turned around. Nachi and Haguro were still not in sight. There was, in fact, nothing to be seen but the many Japanese transports sluggishly fanning out behind us. I shouted, "Gunners and torpedomen, get ready. Our target is the lead cruiser in the enemy column." All noises in my ship were suddenly hushed. We were heading for our first major sea battle. The silence was broken by Iwata's voice. "Commander, look, Nachi and Haguro there." I looked around and saw the long-awaited cruisers on the eastern horizon. They were far away, but could make it. Good. I nodded. The time was 17:30. The enemy ships suddenly altered course to the west and began running almost parallel to us. This was another puzzling development. The enemy must have seen our column formation. Why did he refuse to go straight ahead? By staying on his original course, the enemy could have chosen broadside targets while keeping himself only thinly exposed to Japanese gunfire. That enemy movement again enabled us to gain time. Admiral Takagi leaped with joy when he saw the enemy, still 36,000 meters distant, swerving to the parallel course. "Now I can catch up with our fleet," he yelled. At 1746, Takagi's battle orders were issued. Deploy in 3 columns and head on course 170 degrees south. 1 minute later, cruiser Naka opened fire at the enemy 22,000 meters away, too far for its 14-centimeter guns. Realizing the mix-up, Takagi hurriedly changed his orders. Keep course parallel to the enemy. Cruiser Jintsu and her 4 destroyers swung out and moved some 10,000 meters along the western course of the force. Jintsu fired its 6 14-centimeter guns at De Ruyter, 18,000 meters away. The shells were wasted. The 4 destroyers watched glumly. At that distance, their 12.7-centimeter guns were also useless. Nachi and Haguro started shooting their 20-centimeter guns from a distance of 25,000 meters. Their shells were equally ineffective. The Allied fleet swerved again, gradually to the southwest, increasing the distance from our ships. The enemy guns were now blazing, but the distance was also too great for them. All their shells were wasted. At 18:05, Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura, commanding Destroyer Squadron 4, apparently lost patience with the ineffective gun duel over a widening distance. Nishimura's cruiser Naka and his 7 destroyers released 43 torpedoes at the enemy, then estimated to be more than 15,000 meters distant. The oxygen torpedoes, pride of the Imperial Navy, could run 40,000 meters at a speed of 36 knots. But released at such a distance, even they could not be expected to hit moving targets, except by sheer chance. Of these torpedoes, a dozen or so blew up after running a few thousand meters. There is no explanation of why they exploded. It may have been a mechanical failure, or perhaps some of them collided and their explosions induced the others to explode. The other torpedoes went on, but hit nothing. They too were wasted. Allied officers must have been astounded at the range and speed of these torpedoes. It must have been quite nerve-wracking. After the torpedo attack, the Allied fleet turned sharply to the south. At 18:27, 8 Allied planes appeared. They flew on some 20 miles ahead of us and headed for our transports. About a dozen Zero fighters, which had been called in from Balikpapan at the time our escort ships had deserted the convoy, gleefully pounced on the enemy bombers. All of the enemy planes were shot down before they released any bombs at the Japanese transports. This attempted enemy air attack was yet another puzzling development of the day. It was cloudy, with a lowering sun piercing the clouds from time to time. But dusk was fast approaching, and sunset would be at 1950. By 1833, Admiral Takagi determined that we were merely wasting ammunition, and the possibility was growing that the enemy might flee under the dark of night if we continued the battle in that fashion. He ordered all ships to close and charge the enemy. The enemy fleet had again turned to starboard and was now heading due west. The Japanese ships also turned to the west, with guns blazing. 4 minutes later, British cruiser Exeter was afire, causing sudden confusion in the enemy formation. The enemy ships promptly emitted thick smoke screens. It was later learned that a 20-centimetre shell from Nachi or Haguro had hit Exeter's powder magazine. Exeter, in the second position in the Allied column, lost speed rapidly. In slowing, she swung to the left out of column and barely avoided collision with the following American cruiser Houston. An amazing development followed when Houston also swerved to the left, and all the following ships did the same. Flagship De Ruyter alone continued straight ahead, and it was a few minutes before she discovered that the rest of the column had turned off. In turning around to rejoin them at full speed, she almost collided with a destroyer. This sudden chaos in the Allied formation enabled us to close, and 8 Japanese destroyers, including mine, went dashing in at 30 knots. The Allied fleet reformed, leaving the limping Exeter behind, and the guns of every ship were levelled directly at us. At 7,000 metres from the enemy fleet, destroyer Tokitsukaze, a little ahead of Amatsukaze, took a shell hit. Amatsukaze was enveloped by thick white smoke bursting from Tokitsukaze, which blinded us. Shells rained all around, raising water pillars on every side, but still none reached my ship. I gritted my teeth and made a dogged dash as the enemy shells came closer and closer. I had to continue if I was to release my torpedoes effectively. The enemy was heading northwest, directly toward us, in his first aggressive operation of the day. 6,000 metres to the enemy now. Sweat streamed down my face as I grasped the bridge railing. Not yet. Wait. We must close to at least 5,000 metres. Enemy shells were falling close and could hit my ship at any moment. At 1927, Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka ordered his cruiser to release 8 torpedoes. When Jinsu's fish swished out of their tubes, I could hardly restrain an order for gunfire. A near miss dashed water on my face. My knees shook and my arms trembled at the time. I grow quite uncomfortable when I think of it even now. I was not worried about being a coward, but was concerned that my cool judgment might vanish, being under the fire of enemy ships for the first time. I saw 16 more torpedoes spring into the water from Yukikaze and Tokitsukaze. At this, I gave in and yelled, "Fire torpedoes!" 4 other destroyers followed Amatsukaze's lead. I calculated the chances of a hit. Very slim at 6,000 metres, perhaps less than 5%, 3 hits out of the 72, I figured. How wrong this proved to be. The enemy fleet made a rapid turn to the west, and I saw that at least half of our torpedoes would pass beyond the enemy bows. The rest of the fish reached the area of the targets, but all seemed to have missed, when suddenly there was a tremendous flash. Dutch destroyer Courtenaire was hit and sank instantly. 1 hit out of 64 shots. What poor aiming, and how excellent were the enemy's evasion tactics. Rear Admiral Shoji Nishimura's cruiser Naka and his 7 destroyers arrived presently and also released 64 torpedoes. The enemy again swung 90 degrees, this time to the north, in an unorthodox, fantastic movement, and all 64 of these torpedoes were wasted. The enemy then took 2 more 90-degree turns, and the whole column turned around in a thick smoke screen. Such tactics were not to be found in the Imperial Navy manual. I just stood and gaped. An enemy shell hit destroyer Asagumo, killing 5 and wounding 19, disabling its engine for a time. After the torpedo release, our 2nd Squadron and Naka's 4th Squadron drew their courses in looping curves and turned in a complex movement. The distance to the enemy fleet was steadily expanding. Our chances appeared to be lost. However, Allied behaviour on this night was really inscrutable. After having made a 360-degree turn, The enemy had apparently turned heel and run under the thick smoke screens, but the Allied fleet then made 2 more rapid 90-degree turns and headed back straight to the north. The enemy intention remains a mystery. Perhaps they still wanted to make a drive against the Japanese convoy. Japanese cruisers Nachi and Haguro, trailing far behind the 2 destroyer squadrons, saw the enemy and turned around. At about 2,000 hours, they released 16 torpedoes at a range of 16,000 meters. The distance was too great. The Allied fleet again made a 360-degree turn, and all these torpedoes were also wasted. The enemy fleet sped at full steam southward towards Surabaya. The Japanese cruisers would not chase. The staff officers uneasily watched a series of about 12 explosions to the south. They had no idea what the explosions were and suspected that enemy submarines were attacking the Japanese destroyers. It was later ascertained that these explosions were simply their own torpedoes, which had travelled 40,000 meters to the south, hitting the shore. In the gathering darkness, we could also see the Surabaya lighthouse, just 20 miles away. At 20:30 hours, Takagi ordered all ships to break off pursuit and gather near the transports. The battle was indeed a series of blunders made by each side. Almost every man in Tanaka's Destroyer Squadron 2 was disgruntled at the order to break off action. Our ships had not expended as much ammunition as the others, and I also felt that we had forfeited a chance of giving hot pursuit and finishing off the enemy. When Takagi saw that all the destroyers were turning to the north, he ordered Nachi and Haguro to halt and pick up the 5 scout planes catapulted from these cruisers earlier. Takagi almost paid with his life as a result of this decision. Only a serious blunder by the enemy saved him. It was technically difficult to pick up the planes ditching near the vessels. Later in the war, many Japanese warships simply gave up their planes once they were catapulted. At that time, however, while Japan was winning, commanders were eager to recover catapulted planes. So Takagi was quite right in his decision to recover his flyers. He was entirely wrong, however, in thinking that the Allied fleet had fled to Surabaya. At 20:50, Nachi was trying to pick up the last of the 5 planes when a lookout called, "Battleship Division 3 has arrived." Commander Ishikawa looked through his binoculars. 3-masted ships," he mumbled. "Yes, they look like Haruna and Kirishima." "How did they get here? They were in the Indian Ocean just 2 days ago," the information officer remarked incredulously on the bridge of Nachi. 30 seconds later, Ishikawa screamed in rage. "Damn! Those are enemy ships, and 4 of them are heading toward us." "They are only 12,000 meters away." There was furor and commotion everywhere in the ship. The 2 cruisers were stopped dead. How could ships fight when they were dead in the water, and the crews were not at battle stations? A dozen flares were fired by the oncoming enemy. Admiral Takagi bit his lip so hard that he drew blood. He was in agony. "Hurry up the plane recovery," he ordered. "All men to battle stations." Spines tingled. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. "The plane is caught," yelled the winchman. Takagi roared, "Engine, full astern!" Nachi's engines shuddered to life. The ship slowly began to move backward, a plane dangling at its side by the winch cable. The enemy cruisers opened fire, and near misses began dropping all around. Takagi ordered smoke as Nachi and Haguro got up to 18 knots, the minimum fighting speed. Both ships turned and opened fire but, knowing they were outnumbered, did not use searchlights. The ensuing gun duel, conducted at a distance of 12,000 meters, merely wasted ammunition on both sides. After 10 minutes, Nachi and Haguro lost sight of the opposing ships, and the crisis was over. But a new anxiety arose. Takagi said, "The enemy may be headed for our transports." The 2 cruisers went to 30 knots in frantic search for the enemy ships which 20 minutes earlier had given them such a scare. Takagi ordered cruiser Jintsu, some 5,000 meters away, to catapult its remaining plane and scout for the enemy. Admiral Tanaka responded quickly. At 21:45, the Jintsu plane radioed, "An enemy force of 4 cruisers and 6 destroyers is heading south." This news relieved the harried officers in Nachi and Haguro. Evidently our 2 cruisers had encountered the enemy as he was making the last 90-degree turn of a 180-degree movement. The Allies had not expected to meet the Japanese in that fashion and had pursued their planned course to the south. They thereby lost an excellent chance to maul our forces. Had they rushed in for a showdown, they could at least have crippled Nachi and Haguro and might have then massacred the unguarded transports. The enemy naval force had taken a beating. Burning Exeter headed for Surabaya. 3 destroyers were sunk. 6 other destroyers, badly damaged, had also cleared the area. The remaining Allied ships regrouped close to the Java coast. There were 4 cruisers, De Ruyter, Houston, Perth and Java, and 2 destroyers, which assembled in a series of their familiar turns. They valiantly decided to head north in another attempt to challenge the Japanese. Unfortunately, they had already missed their best chance. The force made one 90-degree turn, then another. British destroyer Jupiter hit an Allied mine and sank instantly. The 5 other ships did not retreat. They made one more turn of 45 degrees to head straight north, illumined from time to time by flares dropped from the Jintsu plain. The moon was bright, but frequent rain squalls reduced visibility. The Allies headed for their final bid, driving through the darkness which was punctuated by Japanese flares. Japanese warships were also being reformed and readied for a night action. Only a few had been hit, none sunk. All were in fighting shape, eager for a scrap. Heavy cruisers Nachi and Haguro kept watch to the north in accordance with steady reports from the Jintsu scout plane. At 33 minutes past midnight on February 28th, there was a flurry on the bridge of Nachi as it appeared that the enemy was heading doggedly to the north. Nachi and Haguro immediately swung northward to parallel the Allied column and slowed down to achieve a good attack angle. Economy of fuel and ammunition was a matter of great concern to the Japanese ships, so their gunfire was only intermittent. No hits were scored on the enemy ships. Some Allied accounts published after the war say the Allied fleet at the time knew nothing about the approaching Japanese ships. Nachi, however, reports that there was return fire, but that it was ineffective. At 0053, Nachi released 8 torpedoes and Haguro 4 at targets bearing 60 degrees to starboard. The enemy ships were 10,000 meters distant. Encountering a brief rain squall, the Japanese officers crossed their fingers and hoped. At 0106, the dark night was suddenly lit by a tremendous fire pillar to the southeast. A torpedo had hit cruiser Java amidship. 4 minutes later, there was another explosion in the Allied column, and De Ruyter burst into flames to burn like a matchbox. Sailors on the decks of Nachi and Haguro shouted "Banzai!" They leaped and danced and slapped each other on the back with joy. Admiral Takagi spoke coolly. "Let's finish off the remaining ships." Nachi and Haguro rushed northeast at full speed through little rain squalls. Failing to locate any other ships, they swung near the 2 burning ships. "Don't waste ammunition on them," Takagi said. "They are done for." The search was called off at 0300. The last puzzle of the day was the movement of the American cruiser Houston and Australian cruiser Perth. And Takagi's fruitless search to the north was probably the last Japanese mistake of the battle. The other 2 Allied ships had turned around as soon as Java and De Ruyter burst into flames. They moved southwest, following the coast, a curious finale to their defiant northward sortie. 9 minutes past midnight on March 1st, destroyer Fubuki spotted 2 unidentified ships. They were located some 10,000 meters east of Babi Island, near Bantan Bay, roughly 500 nautical miles from the scene of the Java Sea battle. Commander Yasuo Yamashita, Fubuki's skipper, had no idea what these ships were. Fubuki swung around and followed some 8,000 meters behind the 2 mysterious ships. The ships were Houston and Perth, and the mystery is how they ever made the 24-hour voyage without being observed during the day by Japanese scout planes. After the long hours of fighting in the running battle of the Java Sea, these ships were low in ammunition. They had made a 500-mile voyage at some 20 knots and were also running low on fuel. They were in no shape to strike back at a vastly superior Japanese force. The two ships, headed for fuel and ammunition supplies, must have been astounded to sight a 56-ship Japanese convoy in Banten Bay, ready for landing. They bravely started to shell these transports at 37 minutes past midnight. Japanese destroyer Harukaze dashed forward to lay smokescreens. Destroyer Fubuki fired 9 torpedoes. Rear Admiral Akisaburo Hara's 12 escorting warships scrambled in confusion and chaos. Fubuki had notified them of 2 mysterious ships entering the bay, but they were still not fully prepared for a battle. There were just too many opposing the 2 allied ships. Some of the skippers told me later they were busy the whole time evading friendly shells and torpedoes. Within an hour, however, both allied ships were sunk. 3 Japanese transports were badly damaged, and 1, the troop command ship, was sunk. General Hitoshi Imamura, the top army commander, was thrown into the sea and had to swim to shore. Japanese casualties were extremely light. An investigation committee studied this confused battle but produced no solution as to how the Japanese transports were sunk. There were opinions that the transports had been hit by Fubuki's torpedoes, which were fired from a distance of 7,000 meters. But other Japanese ships had released at longer ranges. While all the transports completed their landings successfully near Surabaya, cruisers Nachi and Haguro were busy. They contacted another group of 3 remaining enemy ships about noon the same day near Bowen Island to the north. The 2 Japanese ships, reinforced by cruisers Ashigara and Mayoko, sank the limping British cruiser Exeter at 13:30. British destroyer Encounter was sunk 10 minutes later, and US destroyer Pope was finished off at 15:30. Only 4 American destroyers managed to flee from Bali Strait to the south. 4 others were sunk by Japanese planes from the Nagumo task force. Not a single transport or warship was lost in the convoy headed by Takagi. He achieved his purpose with complete success, and the battle ended in a lopsided Japanese victory. Nevertheless, Takagi was furiously attacked for his series of blunders. He was particularly criticized for having opened fire at a range of 28,000 meters and wasting ammunition. When the battle ended, Nachi, for instance, had only 7 shells left for each of its 10 20-centimeter guns. Tanaka's Jintsu had practically no fuel and was almost adrift. Gunnery officers scorned Takagi, saying, "He's a submariner and doesn't know how to use guns." Takagi and his aide, Nagasawa, offered no excuses. Takagi was soon transferred to command of a submarine fleet. Nagasawa returned to Tokyo and was assigned to the Personnel Bureau. This action taught many lessons. After my ship's first encounter and release of torpedoes, we remained outside the main scene of battle. But I observed much of the action and saw the fire pillars of Java and De Ruyter from a distance. This one battle meant more to me than all the hundreds of practice maneuvers in which I had participated. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka ordered my destroyer to Banjarmasin for refueling in the afternoon of February 28th, when he had determined that the waters near Surabaya were clear of all hostile surface ships. I was to escort the Dutch hospital ship we had halted before the battle opened, taking it to the nearest Japanese base in Borneo. "Be sure to take on a maximum load of fuel on your way back," Tanaka cautioned, "because our other ships will have to refuel from you." Our flotilla had joined the operation from Timor and was badly short of fuel. My ship Amatsukaze barely had fuel to reach Banjarmasin at the economical speed of 18 knots. Tanaka was properly doubtful that any of the other ships could have made it. Passing Bowen Island, we sighted men in the water. Coming closer, we found that there were some 100 Caucasians, apparently from Allied ships sunk in the midnight encounter. Hands raised in appeal for help, they cried, "Water! Water!" The sight was pitiable. I had no personal hatred for the drowning enemy. But what could I do? My small ship could take 40 or 50 of them at most. How could I discriminate and pick only half of these survivors? Moreover, my fuel supply was rapidly dwindling. If I should halt the ship, braving the chance of attack from possible enemy submarines, it was doubtful if we could make port. I wavered, but could come to only one conclusion. I had to close my eyes to the miserable men floating in the water. I ordered a message sent to Admiral Tanaka. More than 100 enemy survivors adrift 60 miles, 270 degrees from Bowen Island. Urge rescue effort. The navigator took the ship cautiously past the drifting men. One of my lieutenants, who spoke good English, ran to the rail and shouted, "Hang on! Hang on! A rescue ship will come soon." We made Banjarmasin with the Dutch hospital ship. After refuelling and taking on board all possible oil, we headed back to Surabaya on March 3rd. Passing Bowen, I looked around but saw none of the Allied survivors. We had had no word of any rescue operation in these waters since the previous day, and I felt very depressed. I reviewed the awkward battle of the Java Sea. It seemed strange to me that no enemy submarines had joined in the action. Perhaps the engagement was so brief that the submarines had no time to arrive on the scene. It was also puzzling that we had not seen more enemy destroyers. I was startled from these musings by the sight of a great rising of foam and water on our port hand, which had the appearance of a submerging submarine. I called to the sonar men for a target report. The sonar officer replied, "Sir, our acoustic sonar can't receive effectively while we are steaming like this at 20 knots. I looked back at the queer foam, already far behind, but kept my ship on course. I debated turning back until it was too late to do so. Why couldn't I act promptly and decisively? I cursed my indecision and the possibly lost opportunity. Warrant officer. Iwata stepped forward, stood miserably at attention, and said, "Commander, it was my fault, sir. I should have spotted the sub before it submerged. Please blame me." Iwata was an expert lookout. His eyes were unbelievably keen. Where other spotters might observe the tiny image of a surfacing submarine at 10,000 meters, Iwata could spot them at distances up to 20,000 meters. But Iwata and the rest of us had been caught off guard. We rejoined the Tanaka flotilla soon afterward and fueled cruiser Jintsu and the 3 destroyers, which were almost bone dry. By 2030, on March 1st, the fueling was completed. Jintsu and the 4 destroyers then formed up 2,500 meters between each ship in a hunt for enemy submarines. It was a cloudy night with limited visibility, but the sea was calm and we hoped to discover surfaced targets. Staring, straining, my crewmen clung to their posts, still bitter and angry from our midday failure. A sub-hunt by our ships, having no radar, was a game calling for great patience. Detection depended on the eyes of the spotters and our none-too-effective sonar equipment. Our 5 ships zigzagged at 18 knots for 6 hours, but made no sightings. The patience of the crew was wearing thin, and the spotters were exhausted. In the early morning of March 2nd, lookout Megita shouted, "A black object, 40 degrees to port. It appears to be a submarine." Every man on the bridge came suddenly alert. I raised my binoculars but could discern nothing in the darkness. Megita said abjectly, "It now looks like floating debris." This brought a general sigh of disappointment. Through binoculars I could see what looked like a broken native boat. With this let down, fatigue returned, and for the next hour we had to fight against drowsiness. At 0340, starboard lookout, Bunichi Ikeda cried out, "An unidentified object bearing 30 degrees. It may be a submarine." All eyes strained in that direction. Something was there. Then Ikeda shouted again, "Positive submarine!" Keen-eyed Iwata, the forward lookout, dejected at being scooped, turned and said, "Definitely a submarine! Damn!" I walked to the tripod on which Ikeda's big 20-centimetre binoculars were mounted to get a close look. It was unmistakably a submarine, apparently in trouble, some 6,000 meters away. I shouted orders. Make number 2 battle speed, 26 knots. Right, 50 degrees. Everybody to battle stations. Gunners ready for action. Ready searchlights. Ready depth charges. The crew, freed from the wearying search game, responded gleefully to the orders. The deck, long still and quiet, was now a beehive of activity. The ship quickly picked up speed. An orderly ran from astern with the message that destroyer Hatsukaze was following us. All right, tell the signalman to light up the blue tail lamp, showing 26 knot speed, I replied. Hatsukaze may want to cooperate. Iwata shouted, surfacing submarine now distant 3,500 meters. Lieutenant Aquino hollered from his fire control post. Commander, guns ready to open fire, sir. We'll fire when target is at 2,500 meters, 60 degrees to starboard. The enemy submarine appeared to be adrift. Our 6 12.7 centimeters guns and the 90 centimeters searchlight were rotated to the 60-degree angle. Aquino, observe strict blackout in turrets, I shouted. We raced headlong for the target. At 2,700 meters, a Matsukaze came around to port, bringing all guns to bear directly on the submarine. Shine searchlight! Open fire! I yelled. The submarine showed up clearly, and the first salvo followed. I saw 7 crewmen running around helplessly on the deck. A moment later, 2 yellow explosions burst among them, followed 5 seconds later by the second salvo. One of these 6 shells hit the target, then the third salvo, and again 1 direct hit. The submarine blazed fiercely. Hatsukaze's first salvo was over. The second salvo barely missed, and there was no third salvo. The submarine sank so fast that it had disappeared among the waves before we arrived at the spot. We dropped 6 depth charges to cinch the job. We cut down our speed to 12 knots and combed the area together with Hatsukaze. Our sonars did not pick up any targets, but the area smelled strongly of heavy oil. We abandoned the search at 0359 and left the scene. 2 hours later, we returned to the same area, because I wanted a Matsukaze's crew to view the heavy oil on the surface. Only a few officers on the bridge and the gun crew had seen the burning sub. I decided it was important to show everyone the fruit of their great strain and efforts. Oil was still rising at the place where the sub had sunk. It stretched out for miles on the surface of the sea, and the scene made a great impression on my crew. My elation over our first definite kill was diminished by the fact that our victim had already been in trouble when we attacked. It was too much like cold-blooded murder to sink a ship that could offer no resistance. We continued our hunt the following night, though the weather was quite bad, with intermittent driving rain. The big binoculars were almost useless because rain drenched their lenses. Visibility was not more than a few thousand meters.